Good morning, everyone, and thank you for participating in the working group meeting for the native load calculation and available transfer capability topics as part of phase 2 of the Transmission Service and Market Scheduling Priorities Initiative. I'm Christina Osborne with ISO's Stakeholder Engagement Team, and I will be facilitating the meeting. We move to the agenda. So during today's meeting, Abby Knowles and Kevin Johnson from BPA have offered to present their practices for calculating ATC. I'll start by reviewing a few housekeeping items, and then I'm going to turn the meeting over to Milos Basanic from ISO's Market Policy and Performance Group to kick off the meeting. There are several other working group members and ISO representatives who are on the speaker line. They are listed in the panelist window. I'm not going to read through all their names. So we are still in the process of firming up the dates for additional meetings. The Joint California LSEs have confirmed that they are able to present on December 10th, and then we are waiting to hear from VISTRA to confirm if they are available to present on either December 6th or 7th, and we'll keep you posted on those details. And again, if anyone else is interested in presenting their ideas and perspectives, please let us know and we can work with you to schedule another meeting. There will be an opportunity to ask questions during this session. I'll provide instructions for how to raise your hand at that time. We'll first start by taking questions from the working group members and the panelists, and then we'll open it up to the rest of the stakeholder participants. And of course, if you are more comfortable sending your question in the chat, of course, we welcome that. You can send it either to myself or to all panelists, and I will read the questions out to the rest of the group. So we do record these sessions for information and convenience purposes only. As a reminder that any related transcriptions should not be reprinted without ISO's permission. The video files from the past working group meetings are available on the initial web page, and I provided a link here on this slide to the initial web page. It also includes the presentations from the past working group meetings, as well as other initiative-related information. So these working group discussions are intended to foster open dialogue, sharing of ideas and perspectives, and overall brainstorming on the different topics in the subgroup. These discussions may not be representations of official company perspectives and should not be treated as such in order to foster open dialogue and idea sharing. So with that, I will go ahead and turn the meeting over to Milos Basanic.
Thank you, Christina, and good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us on another early morning after Thanksgiving. Really appreciate you being with us. As Christina noted, over the last few working group sessions, or a couple of working group sessions, we heard from Idaho Power Company, as well as the Salt River Project on their practices and how they calculate different components of the ATC methodology, including how they calculate the native load needs, as well as different types of margins that they may utilize. And today we're going to hear from BPA about their practices. So if you recall, the progression that we've been through thus far is really hearing from our regional partners on how they calculate aspects of the ATC methodology and derive those native load or network load needs that will ultimately inform how we may be able to, at the ISO, to do the similar thing, calculate those native load needs and the amount of transmission that may need to be set aside for meeting those native load needs, as well as different other components and margins of the ATC methodology. So after the BPA presentation, the next set of meetings will really be focused on stakeholders that have participated in these discussions and sharing their perspectives and their ideas on how some of these aspects could be calculated by the ISO, the different inputs and the different information that can be utilized to calculate those different aspects of the ATC methodology. And those next sessions should also foster good collaboration and good dialogue and idea sharing. So we look forward to that. With that, let's then I think we can move into the presentation from Kevin and Abby, and like Christina noted, we'll pause for questions throughout parts of the presentation. We'll start with questions from the different panelists, the core group members, and then we'll open it up to the broader stakeholder group for any questions that they may have. And again, I want to extend our appreciation and thanks to Kevin and Abby for making themselves available, putting together the presentation and taking the time to do that. To the extent that any questions come up that Abby and Kevin, you don't feel comfortable responding to because it goes into a certain level of detail, or you may not know the answer to, I think it's completely fine to know that you may not be able to answer that, and we may need to circle back. But really appreciate you taking the time, and I'll turn it over to you, Kevin and Abby. Thank you again.
Thanks,
Christina and Milos. Good morning, everyone. I hope you can hear me well. This is Abby Nolf. I work for Bonneville Power Administration's Transmission Services. I've been with Bonneville now for February will be 20 years. I've worked on or around ATC calculations for most of that time. In fact, I was on the drafting team that developed the ATC mods, that suite of NERC standards. So this is my favorite topic of conversation, at least at work. And we are happy to share with you our kind of unique calculation methodology. Kevin, would you like to introduce yourself as well?
Sure, I'm Kevin Johnson. I'm in the transmission operations in the short-term ATC group. In December, it'll be 29 years that I've been at BPA. The first part of my career was as a hydroscheduler, or in the hydroscheduling group, and I came to the transmission side to work on congestion management in 2006. So I've been doing this for about 15 years.
All right. And so if we go to the next slide. So BPA has a mix of what was referred to as the rated path or flow gates. We refer to them internally as one-to-one paths or flow-based paths. We've got some maps on following slides that we'll use to explain those two differences. Mod 29, that NERC ATC standard, is the one that Bonneville has selected to attempt to comply with, to follow for our short-term ATC calculations. It's used within our 0 to 13-month time horizon for all of our paths. So we use Mod 29 in one way for our one-to-one paths, and we apply that same standard in a different way for our flow-based paths. And I understand there might be questions about that, so we're happy to take those when the time comes. For our one-to-one paths, BPA calculates ATC by using, I think, the very traditional application for Mod 29, which is each megawatt of transmission that's granted is deducted from the ATC. And so if we sell 1 megawatt, we deduct 1 megawatt from the coffers and continue on until we're out of capacity. For our flow-based calculations, BPA calculates ETC by using the power flow study as well as power transfer distribution factors, or PTDFs. And the reason that we do that is that we conduct our ETC power flow studies only periodically. They're not updated on a continual basis. And so between those power flow kind of re-baselinings, we use the PTDFs to approximate the outcome of a power flow to keep track of new offers that have been made in the interim. So that methodology sums a base ETC as well as the interim ETC. The base ETC comes from the power flow, the interim comes from the PTDFs, and the note there at the bottom, for any of you who use PTDFs, this will likely look very familiar, but the source PTDF less the sink PTDF is multiplied by the demand to determine what the interim impact would be. This next slide is the map of the BPA constraints, or ATC paths. We've got, this is the long term, which is beyond 13 months. And the dotted lines, apologies for any of you that are colorblind, the dotted lines that are in purple are the one-to-one paths that we calculate, the fairly simplistic, just rated path one-to-one calculation. And you'll note that that's essentially at our borders. We do have a couple internal to Bonneville on the long-term market, and those are radial lines. So it doesn't make sense to do a full-blown power flow for a radial line. So we've got some of those on the boundaries and a couple of them on the internals, but the red solid lines are the more complicated power flow or power flow-based calculations. The next slide, we've got the map for the short-term constraints. You'll note, especially if you flick back and forth between these two, because they look very similar, we've got a few extra paths in the short-term market that are not monitored on a long-term basis. And so that's why we've got the two separate maps. on the next slide, so we've broken up our presentation today into the long-term and the short-term because the NERC ATC standards apply just in the short-term market. And so we have kind of a long-standing long-term ATC methodology that is calculated a little bit differently. So ATC for the long-term, 13 months out to 10 years. Only firm reservations are used to calculate our long-term ETC, and we don't calculate long-term non-firm. So beyond 13 months, we only sell firm products. And we don't use CBM, TRM, counterflows, or postbacks in the long-term ATC calculations at all. Kevin, would you like to take on this slide?
Sure. So we, instead of just having one firm ATC, we've got a few different timing and methods for calculating ATC in the short term. We'll try to explain how that works. The first is our short-term firm ATC. So as Abby mentioned, short-term is that 0 to 13 month time horizon. When we're calculating our firm ATC, we use our firm reservations to develop our firm ETC, the existing transmission commitments. And then we also do make use of short-term adjustments on paths if either the power flow or the PTDF is not encumbering or releasing the ETC properly. We've used that in the past as generalizations for different scenarios that we have opted not to run, and then we've added those scenarios back in and take out the adjustment. So they're alternatives to modeling is short-term adjustments. Also, although they're in the equation, we don't use CBM, counterflows, or postbacks in the short-term firm ATC. We do have a few short-term ATC paths where we do apply TRM, and those are at the northern intertie in both directions, north to south and south to north, our SATSUP injection path, and also west of Garrison, east to west. And I'll note that those are all one-to-one paths. So moving on to our non-firm ATC, so that was firm, our non-firm ATC, we have two different time horizons. One we call the beyond real-time horizon. And in this horizon for our non-firm ATC, we're using both firm and non-firm reservations to calculate our non-firm ETC. We use the same adjustments, the same ETC adjustments in the non-firm as we do for the firm. So if it's taking away firm capacity or granting or relieving firm capacity, it's treated the same in the non-firm. Again, in the non-firm, we don't use CBM or postbacks in short-term non-firm ATC. When we do have a TRM that is non-firm, again in the northern intertie both directions. And then when we get into the horizon where we're using schedules, then we do include counterflow schedules, except for the dynamic, pseudo-tie, and capacity tag types, in which case we hold out the entire reservation. The third variation is non-firm ATC in the real-time horizon. So to differentiate our beyond real-time and our real-time, that changeover happens at 2200 on the day prior to the delivery day. So this is not following WEC pre-schedule. It's always at 10 o'clock the night before, where we move to using, for our non-firm ATC, we move to using schedules. So we're using firm schedules and non-firm schedules rather than reservations. We're also using non-firm reservations that have not been scheduled yet. If somebody just went and bought some non-firm, got a non-firm TSR, but they haven't scheduled on it yet, we expect them to use it. So we do hold out that reservation until it's scheduled, then we'll use the schedule. And again, this is for short-term, non-firm in that real-time horizon. We're not using CBM in any of the short-term. Again, those counterflow schedules are included, except dynamic pseudo-tying capacity, where we're holding out the total reservation in case they need to be used. We do use postbacks on the COI in the north to south direction. And this is to allow us to make use of the unshared portions of these other capacity ownership agreements on a non-firm basis. So if there are multiple capacity owners, and we release that as non-firm capacity, and that's by contract. And then also we continue to have TRM in the northern intertie, both directions in the real-time horizon. So we've got the firm, short-term firm, short-term non-firm in the beyond real-time, and then short-term non-firm in the real-time. So three different ways of calculating ATC.
Kevin, you do have a question in the queue. Let me know when you're ready to take a break for questions.
Yeah, this would be a good time for a break.
Okay. Yeah, so we'll go ahead and take Tyrone's question. And if any of the panelists have any questions, please raise your hand. Or if anybody else has a question, there's a hand icon above the chat window. Go ahead and click on that. If you just dialed into the meeting, you can press #2. So let's go ahead and go to Tyrone.
All right, Tyrone, your line is being unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hi there, this is Tyrone from PG&E. Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Excellent. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for this portion of the presentation. I have a couple of questions. One, I wanted to just confirm my understanding as you were referring to some of the mod standards and how BPA is using the ATC calculation. You introduced or you use the term flow gate, and I wanted to make sure I'm understanding exactly what that means. When I'm thinking of the mod standards, you refer to the various paths that have gone through the WEC rating process, but when you refer to flow gates, are you assuming branch groups that you are applying an ATC calculation to that are bringing per se imports into the BPA's balancing area? Is that how you're using it?
So our flow gates, which is actually not a term that Bonneville uses, it's a term we used to use, but we realized a while ago that our constraints that we apply flow-based calculations to aren't maybe consistent with what everybody else is calling flow gates. So we've tried to stop using that terminology. I used it here because I thought that might actually create less confusion. But
okay.
So our flow-based calculations are almost exclusively internal to BPA's system. So if we were to go back to the map, You'll see all those red lines are inside the BPA footprint. And those calculations or those constraints are identified based on where our dispatchers historically have seen potential overloads. And so the definition is probably not a consistent one. They're essentially the pulse points on our system where we have seen traditionally and historically congestion, and that they're places that we choose to monitor. But they're not defined in the way that NERC would define a flow gate.
Gotcha. But you're still using that same, you're using I won't say the same, but a similar calculation of ATC on those paths or on those flow gates.
Well, again, we are using a power flow to derive our base ETC, but we use mod 29 in kind of an unusual way to calculate the ATC on those paths. So we use the power flow to derive an ETC. We deduct that from the TTC to arrive at what our ATC values are. So I would say probably most entities that I'm aware of that are using a version of flow gates or flow-based constraints like this are applying mod 30. BPA elected not to do that.
Gotcha. Okay.
Yeah.
That's helpful. Sorry, I cut someone off.
No, I was just going to say that, yeah, our calculations are not necessarily like what mod 30 would expect or require.
Right. Now, can you talk a little bit about because you used the term power flow a couple of times. What kind of base case are you using, PSLF or some other power flow program? Is it just DC? Are you only doing a few branches, or is it a full power flow?
So we're using we will talk about that later, but we're using the WEC base case, the bus branch model.
Okay.
Of the WEC base case.
And assuming then, so I would assume then you're using different seasonal cases depending upon what period of the year you're evaluating?
We do. And, and as Kevin
we'll get into that.
We'll get into that some more further in the presentation. And also to answer your question about which program we're using, it's Power World. And something that we just covered too, I realized I didn't speak to. So in your earlier question, you had mentioned WEC rated paths, and I just wanted to clarify that most of BPA's constraints are not WEC rated. A few of them are, but these are places on our system where we've seen congestion that we acknowledge we need to monitor and protect for, but they have not all been through the WEC path rating process.
Gotcha. Okay, that makes sense. Okay, that's it for now. Thank you so much.
Hey, Tyrone, it looks like Jeff Nelson has his hand raised. So go ahead, Jeff.
Hey, good morning, everyone. And also thanks, BPA team, for presenting. So first, just a basic question. You used a terminology that I wasn't familiar with, postbacks. Could you explain what postbacks are?
Sure. So postbacks come from the NERC ATC mods. They're part of the calculation formula for ATC. And I'm doing this from memory, but I believe those standards define postbacks as increases in ATC that come about because either somebody has released capacity or redirected away from a path, and so there is now an increase in ATC availability because you've posted back that capacity that they released.
Okay, that makes sense. And then another question, you said your sort of short-term and long-term are different horizons. Long-term is 13 months and beyond, or I wasn't sure. But
yes.
Could you describe what do people pay for both the long-term rights and what do they pay for the short-term rights?
I doubt that either Kevin or myself have that off the top of our head. I can send you a link to our rate schedules. It would be pretty easy to discern that, but I don't track that sort of thing. Sorry.
Yeah,
okay. I was asking more for the philosophy of pricing rather than the actual rates. Are they paying, when you buy a long-term, again, if you don't know, that's fine. when you're buying long-term, how long-term are you buying it for?
You can purchase service on Bonneville's system in a long-term market for a minimum of 1 year up to 30 years. Now, most of our customers, and this is kind of just anecdotal, are purchasing for 5 years at a time because that's the minimum to achieve right of first refusal to continue, or renewal rights to continue taking service at the termination date of your contract. So most customers are purchasing 5 years at a time in the long term.
And rolling it over if they want it. And then one other question on this. If someone wants capacity, but there's none available, do you have a process for them to subscribe and basically get new transmission built?
Yes, we refer to that process as our on the internal system. So for all those red lines on the map, we've got a transmission expansion process. We refer to it as TSEP. It's a mechanism. So we used to evaluate and process long-term requests that there was insufficient capacity to grant one at a time. And at one point in time, we had over 300 requests in our long-term queue. As you can imagine, things were moving pretty slowly. So in 2008, we implemented our first network open season, which we referred to. TSEP is essentially a version of that open season, but it's morphed over time. So in 2008 was the first time we ran our first cluster study, where everyone in our queue was included in a single massive study to determine what it would take to be able to grant all of that service. Now, again, our methodology and our process has changed over time, and I can send out links to our TSEP business practice that would describe in great detail how we go about conducting those studies now. But essentially, we run an annual process right now where we attempt to respond to all of the pending requests in our queue to identify what it would take, what sorts of infrastructure upgrades would be required to offer them service.
And again, I don't know if you know this, but if someone does want to move forward with that, do you have to have sort of critical mass? Does the line have to be fully funded? And do the people have to pay for 30 years? Or what happens if you're actually going to build something new because of the requests?
Right. So we apply a rate calculation based on what was requested to determine if we can perform that infrastructure upgrade at our existing rate, or if there would need to be an incremental rate. And then that incremental rate, if determined as needed, is allocated out to the requesting parties so that they are allowed to make the choice: do you want to proceed at this higher rate in order to get this line built, or would you prefer not to proceed? And so it's sort of an iterative calculation as folks drop away, or as we proceed down the path and get more and more information and can refine the whatever the plan of service looks like, we can sort of dial that calculation in. But there are a number of off-ramps for parties to leave the process if they determine at any point that it's too expensive.
Now, if someone determines they want to go forward with it, what sort of commitment do they make? Do they make a 30-year commitment at the stated rate?
No, they make whatever commitment they requested. So, but that goes into the rate calculation. So if they only ask for 5 years of service, obviously we then can't assume that they will continue to take service beyond 5 years. So the incremental rate calculation would be based on trying to recoup costs within 5 years. Versus if they ask for 10 or 30 years, we can amortize that over a longer period of time. So it's part of the calculation.
Okay, very helpful. Thank you so much. Thank you. Bye.
See if there are any other hands raised.
I do not see any hands in the queue at this time.
Okay, we go ahead and there you go.
Yeah, we're back on slide 9, and we start getting into the actual meat of it, how we manage those flow-based constraints or flow-based paths. So we develop our base ETC, our starting point, from power flow studies, and the source of these studies is the seasonal WEC base case. So that's a bus branch model that we use to put in all our inputs, and then we calculate the peak transfer across each flow-based constraint. So we model these paths as the lines or transformers, and we run numbers of studies, which we'll go into a couple of slides. And for each of our paths, we find the peak value, and that is our peak commitment across that constraint. We use firm reservations in our base ETC studies, and because we've got we're modeling coincidental load and coincidental generation, counterflows are just sort of built into those power flow studies. They're not necessarily counted explicitly, and so they're baked into the studies rather than counted as part of the calculation, the ATC calculation itself. The seasonal base cases, we are putting in our own inputs. We start off with that base system topology, and then we're putting in loads, different generation patterns, and different intertie import-export levels to sort of stress the system based on potential uses of folks' reservation rights. So we use the winter and summer heavy load seed cases as our starting point for almost all of our flow-based constraints. For the spring studies, the long term, they use a light load case that's created from a peak, from a summer peak load seed case, whereas the short term uses a spring heavy load seed case for the short term spring studies. We do have one exception, which is on west of Hatway, where we use, instead of using a seasonal heavy load seed case, we use light load seed cases. Long term uses the spring case, and the short term uses the spring case, a spring light load case, if it's available. Those don't get generated every time by WEC. We use the spring cases if it's available. Otherwise, we'll use either the winter or summer light load seed case to set our base ETC just on that west of Hatway using the light load case. And then we take these seasonal cases, or in the case of the short-term monthly, transition those to monthly, and then we stress them under different scenarios to again arrive at that ETC, that peak utilization for each path. If we go on to the next slide, slide 11, these are the permutations that we are doing. We've got the season where we're using winter, spring, and summer, and then either peak or off-peak. The wind conditions are, we have either turn the wind on or turn it on and off. We have exports to Canada. We're either exporting to Canada or we, in the short term, or depending on the season, we either do studies exporting to Canada or importing from Canada or both. And then also we're stressing the federal hydro system because we can have sort of peak generation peaking at different times in different areas in different seasons. We're running different permutations where we stress either the federal Upper Columbia plants, the federal Lower Snake River plants, or the Lower Columbia plants. In our short-term only special off-peak case for west of Hatway, we're just flexing the eastern federal hydro plants. So I'll pause there for questions because that's a lot of permutations to take in if folks had specific questions on those. It ends up in the short term that ends up being 12 different permutations, wind on off, Canadian entitlement on off, and then Upper Columbia, Lower Snake, and Lower Columbia. So 12 permutations per case.
Milos does have his hand raised, so if any of the other working group members or panelists have questions, you can go ahead and raise your hand or click on the participant. And there's a little hand icon of the chat window. Give it a moment. And Milos, you can go ahead, and then we'll see if anybody else has questions.
All right. Yeah, thanks, Kevin, for the information. Just a question on the load forecast and the type of load forecast that's utilized. Is it we heard, for example, from Idaho, they use a 1 in 20. I think SRP uses a 1 in 10. What type of forecast do you utilize here? What's the conservancy level?
I believe for the short term, we're using 1 in 2 non-coincidental peak. So we have a number of customers, utility customers in our footprint, and we're using their each one's peak. And Abby, do you know the long term?
Yeah, that's also how we do it in the long term. For the peak loads, we're using 1 in 2 non-coincidental. So acknowledging that 1 in 2 is not, an apparent, very conservative load forecast, but the NCP factor does make it a bit more conservative. Because we're assuming that all customers will peak simultaneously, which doesn't happen.
Right. Okay, no, thank you. And then in terms of the generation assumptions here, I think on this slide is the federal generation assumptions in serving the different network customers that may have rights to that generation. How do you incorporate, and maybe that's in future slides, but how do you incorporate some of the other assumptions about how those network load, customer loads are going to be served, those 1 in 2 non-coincidental peak, aside from these federal generation assumptions? How do you inform some of the other generation assumptions for serving that load?
So we actually already covered it by just stating that what we attempt to model in our cases are the rights. So whatever generation rights have been purchased, those are what we attempt to model in the cases. So an example here would be, we might know that a generator day-to-day historically is going to operate at a certain level, but if they've not purchased that on a firm basis, we're not going to model those generation rights as dispatching in our firm cases. So we attempt to model what is within their transmission contracts, what they've purchased for whatever appropriate time horizon we're calculating for. So I'll speak for the long-term market. We only model what they've purchased on a long-term basis. And in the cases where we have too much generation to model simultaneously because we don't have sufficient load and or modeled exports, we will then reduce generation on a pro rata basis. So we first try to model the rights, and if we can't model everyone's rights, then we back it down a bit, but we do that on a pro rata basis.
Okay, no, thank you for that. And then I assume then, you look at those other purchases, designated resources, et cetera, that they have rights to, and then you effectively backfill with these federal generation assumptions.
That's probably a good back of the envelope explanation. It's a little bit more nuanced, though, in that for some of the resources, so for example, if it's a thermal resource, we will assume that that thermal designated network resource will be used to serve the NT or so Bonneville doesn't have native load, but we've maintained that our version of network integration transmission service is how we would serve native load if we had it. So for all of our NIP customers, if it is a thermal resource that's been designated, we will assume that resource offsets a federal requirement. If, however, the resource is wind or solar, we will then model, again, it's why we run both, all of these varieties of cases. Yeah. In some of them, we model the wind or the solar off because we know that the wind and sun isn't always out. And so we don't completely offset the federal requirement. We will run it both ways, where the federal system is continuing to serve that load, and then one where it's not, so that we can make sure that we're covering all of the variety of scenarios that might occur.
Yeah. Thank you for that, Abby. And then just one last question. In that scenario where you're modeling wind on and off, you are taking the most conservative of those scenarios, essentially reserving the transmission capacity as ETC based on, the most worst case scenario between those?
That is what we are doing at this time, yes.
Thank you. No more questions from me.
Okay, we'll go to Robert and then Tyrone.
Hi, it's Robert Sparks from the California ISO. I just wanted to follow up on Milos's question because I wasn't exactly sure. So it sounds like you model your generation that is contracted, I think, or rights purchases, I think is what you said, but it wasn't clear if that includes the hydro.
It does include the hydro, but not all of the hydro in Bonneville system is federal. So for the non-federal hydro plants, again, we attempt to model what's in their contract. If we can't, if we don't have sufficient load, we'll back that down pro rata with everybody else. There are some calculations or some assessments that we'll make if, for example, if we know that a generator has purchased its full nameplate capacity on a long-term firm basis, but historically they've never operated that way in a certain season because of water constraints or other operating restrictions, we will reflect seasonal capacity limits based on what we've seen historically. So there is a bit of a nuance there. And again, I can send out to Christina the link to this information. Every base case that we perform for the long term, we publish what generation assumptions were made for the big plants within our model, so that we try to make that as transparent as possible so that it's easy to see what particular limits seasonally were applied. I feel like I missed another part of your question, unless I answered it already.
Well, just to be sure, so if the hydro has not been purchased, which is probably unlikely, but let's just say the hydro has not been purchased, but the water's there, will you model that hydro or not?
Are you asking specifically about the federal hydro?
Yeah, the ones in the stressed zones column on the slide we're looking at.
Yeah, so this is quite a complicated answer, and I'm not sure that I'm the expert for this to explain it in enough detail, but at a high level, there is a methodology that Power Services, Bonneville Power, uses to allocate out the federal hydro system, and essentially it is assumed the vast majority of that is designated to serve load. So we have a memorandum of agreement between the two business lines, which is also published on our website so that we try to make that really transparent for folks. We have an agreement per that memorandum of agreement that there is a specific way that we model the hydro system, and that's actually what's arrived at these 3 zones and how we stress them. So essentially what we're saying is the hydro system has been nearly fully subscribed. Meaning it's for the most part, it's essentially been sold.
Thank you.
But when we're talking about what we're modeling, we're talking about in the contracts, transmission contracts, not necessarily power contracts. So
Correct.
So if a network customer, a NIPS customer has designated a resource, say a hydro resource at a certain level, then we'll model it at that level as if they were going to bring it in. And so we're just privy to the transmission contracts, not necessarily whether somebody may or may not have a power purchase agreement for some IPP. They might have transmission, but not have a long-term power purchase agreement. And they're trying to do short-term sales with it or something. So yeah. Did that help?
But it sounded like for the hydro, especially the stress zones here in the slide, those are pretty much assumed to be serving load and using the transmission. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yes.
Great. Thank you.
So let's go ahead and go to Tyrone. I see Milos has his hand raised again, but we'll go to Tyrone first and then back to Milos.
This is really quick. This is a follow-up to Milos and Robert's questions on the gen dispatch. What types of assumptions are you making for renewable dispatch in those same cases? So wind and solar.
So we're modeling their firm transmission rights in the firm cases. So if the solar plant has purchased its full nameplate, that's what we attempt to model. If they've purchased half their output, that's what we attempt to model. But it's also the reason why we run the on and off cases, which we acknowledge are bookends. So there is a whole range of in-betweens, but we model either what they've purchased on a firm basis or completely off.
Okay. But when I heard you, I think what I heard you also say when you model them on, if you don't have sufficient load, you do a pro rata reduction. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And with that being said, are any of your paths voltage constrained, or are they all thermally constrained?
No, we do have voltage and stability limited paths as well.
Okay. Do you take a look at or evaluate the implications? Because I mean, if you are reducing the dispatch of those units in order to balance the load, you're still taking the full VAR contribution of those plants. So have you all looked at if those plants were completely off, or are you just, because if you have something, at roughly 10% of its output, but it's providing all of its VAR capability, then it may create I'm just wondering, how do you all look at that situation?
I don't actually know the answer to that. Kevin, do you?
Yeah, I don't believe we're considering those in the short-term studies. Any potential implications? The TTC studies where we set the limits are done separately, We're just doing the ETC studies, and that's just at the power flow level.
So meaning, and again, I'm not an engineer, so what I understand is that those sorts of issues would come up in setting the limits for the paths. They would not be factored into the ETC calculation itself. So we run, which is another reason why Bonneville elected not to use Mod 30, was that standard was largely written by folks in the Eastern Interconnect that use a single study to determine both their TTC and their ETC simultaneously, which, because of the way our TTCs are required to be calculated here in WEC, we simply cannot do that. So Mod 30 was not a good fit for a lot of reasons, and that was a big one.
Okay. All right. Yeah. Okay. I think I'm following what you're describing. Thank you.
All right, Milos, go ahead.
All right. We'll come full circle, and I promise this is the last question. I think, we recognize as well that the BPA is a little bit unique in that, there are certain statutory obligations to serve loads, and they have rights to generation, and therefore BPA has, I think, what's called load following products that entities have. If one of those load serving entities or a network customer ultimately decides or anticipates that at a future point they may identify, they haven't yet procured, they haven't yet purchased or contracted for a resource, but they anticipate that, let's say 2-3 years from now, they will be acquiring a certain amount of megawatts from a non-federal resource. Is that accounted in some way as well, even though they may not have it under contract? Is that accounted for in some way in calculating ETC?
It is. It's still a relatively new process. I believe we first implemented this process back in 2018, so it's still sort of new for us. But it's acknowledged that the tariff requires NIPS customers to submit 10-year load and resource forecasts. We now solicit that information from them and use that to determine, it's a factor in our ETC calculations. So we'll make an assessment of the 10-year load and resource forecast submitted to us by customers. Specifically, any non-federal potential purchases, we'll take a look at whether or not, given that queue position, when they submitted that forecast to us and who else is in the queue ahead of them and what the existing ATC levels are, we'll determine whether or not we can accommodate that resource forecast if it were designated at some point in the future. And we either encumber ETC for it or we don't and tell the customer, try again, that we don't have room for this. And they can participate in our TSEP or our expansion process if they want to pursue that resource. But essentially, yes, we have a process now where customers can submit to us resource forecasts, and we will create FTSRs to encumber ETC within our calculations. The FTSR, is a OASIS shorthand for forecasted transmission service request, but it's something we create, not something the customer does.
Okay, no, thank you.
I don't see anybody else in the queue or any chat questions, so I think we can go ahead and move on.
Okay, so for the long-term base ETC, which I mentioned earlier, this is the part of our study that's done via the power flow. This, in the long-term market, is done just once a year. Generation rights are modeled, except in our generation surplus scenarios, which we've already covered, in which everything is scaled down pro rata. Each season is calculated separately, so we run the full gamut of all the scenarios individually for each season, and then factor in the difference between the min and the max ETC for each season for each constraint. So a minimum ETC is calculated for a 5-year case as well as the 10-year cases, and then interpolated to essentially approximate the 2, 3, 4, essentially all the years out for 10 years. So that's done via a growth factor. The lowest ETC is determined to be the base ETC. However, because I know this might sound conflicting with what I'd mentioned earlier, We also hold aside the difference between the min and the max ETC values on each flow gate for each season as a commercial uncertainty margin. And the reason that we do that is when we put in place this fairly conservative calculation, so essentially what this means is we're determining our ATC is derived essentially from the highest ETC. So we're selling to the lowest ATC possible. That agreement between the two business lines, again, which is derived from the MOA that set how we model the federal dispatch patterns, we wanted to make room for potential maneuvering and acknowledgement that at some point in the future, it might make sense to not be quite so conservative. And so within our calculations, it's easier to kind of dig into that commercial uncertainty margin than it is to unwind the entire calculation. So within our OASIS site, you will see the commercial uncertainty margin appears in our TRM fields, but it's not a true TRM. It doesn't meet any of the standards, and we've explained this kind of as well as we can within our ATC methodology document, which is linked to at the end of this presentation. So, so essentially, we're selling to the max ETC, which results in then the lowest ATC values. And I won't cover all of the details there, but because we're only calculating seasonal values, but we determine monthly ATCs in the long term, there's kind of the breakout of which cases apply in which, or which seasonal cases apply in which months.
In the short term, over the last couple of years, we've been, well, our short-term ATC group just got formed, I think, 3 years ago. And we have been trying to make improvements to the short-term ATC process. Before that time, it was there was no clear responsible group for short-term ATC. It was sort of pieces were put together from different groups across the agency. There was kind of some done by some studies were done by the long-term folks, and they would do some special seasonal studies for short-term, and they would pass that to another group, and there wasn't really anybody who was looking at the whole short-term process, and now there is. And one of the biggest improvements that we've done is to go from seasonal granularity to monthly granularity, recognizing that we want to get the calculations to use the inputs that most closely match the time of actual delivery. So the WEC seasonal studies for summer are supposed to cover June through October, and they're based on an August peak, and we saw room for improvement there, and so we have taken those seasonal studies and we break them down into monthly studies. And we do this by taking the BPA loads in the WEC seasonal cases, and we replace those with, as I mentioned before, we use 1 and 2 year heavy load peak forecasts for each month for those internal BPA loads. The generation is then modeled based on the scenario being studied, where we look at what rights folks have based on the month, rather than just on August, January, or May. So we have finer detail there, and also the import and export values we're able to model based on the rights, again, at the monthly level. Those are for our heavy load studies. Again, our light load study for west of Hatway we don't go down to monthly on that. We just stick with the seasonal winter, spring, and summer granularity. And we use the loads, the light loads from the cases, except for Montana. And Montana loads, we look at what is in that WEC seasonal light load case and compare that to the light load forecast done by Northwestern Energy, and then we'll use the lower of the two. So if we need to reduce that WEC case, then we'll use the Northwestern Energy forecast. This helps us set that maximum ETC so that we're encumbering the most across west of Hathaway, which is a light load peaking path. Winter studies are November through March. Summer are June through October, and spring is April and May, and we use the spring studies if they're available. Otherwise, for April and May, we'll use the higher ETC from either a summer or winter case. Also in the short term, we set the ETCs through our baselining process, which we do 3 times a year. And our studies are all lines in service, or all lines in their normal operating configuration. We do account for transmission outages in the sort of scheduling window horizon for line outages. So we do, in the 2 to 3 week horizon, we are studying, we're doing studies for TPCs, and also we're recalculating our power transfer distribution factors. And in that time period, we'll get adjustments to the ETC and therefore to our ATC. So if there's a major line outage, that will impact the impacts of transactions across the system. And so we'll recalculate those impacts and recalculate the ETC and recalculate the ATC. So it's constantly being recalculated. The ATC is constantly being recalculated for the PTDS. And then as part of our 3 times a year baselining process, we take from all of those studies, we take the maximum base ETC value from the scenario, the maximum path loading, and that is going to be the base ETC for firm ATC calculations for that path for that month. And then we also, since we're doing all these different permutations, all these different scenarios for each month, for each path, we take the minimum, and that is used as the base ETC for our non-firm ATC calculations. So we actually release more non-firm than firm right off the bat. So as Abby mentioned, here's that link. We post a number of different documents to help people understand our calculations. We have a long-term ATC methodology document, and also in accordance with the MOD standards for short-term, we post our ATC ID and a TRM ID. Those values, ETC, ATC, TRM, TTC, they're posted on Oasis and updated constantly. For long-term ATC, annual values are posted on our external website. We also, in the long-term ATC, there is a annual meeting, customer meeting, to give updates, and that is coming next week, I believe. Abby, the annual long-term ATC study update.
December 7th.
And then also for the short-term ATC, we've been having customer meetings at least twice a year to let customers know about our short-term ATC calculation improvements. Since we started about 3 years ago, we've been meeting probably 4 times a year as we were making wholesale changes to our short-term ATC. So we've been trying to again be transparent with the customers about our ATC calculations and our improvements. Another thing that we just released maybe last year is a commercial transmission inventory map, which is like an all-in-one PTDF impact calculator combined with ATC availability that actually will give you feedback if you put in a transaction that you'd like to test. It will give you feedback not only that you need transmission or you don't need transmission, but whether if there's transmission available or if there's maybe not quite enough transmission available, but maybe there might be some conditional firm available, or whether this request would probably need to go into a study. So, and that's also available just out on our webpage.
That was your last slide. Do you want to go over the appendix slide as well, Kevin? Or?
I don't think so, unless there are specific questions about how Bonneville stresses the federal zones, but that's pretty much in the weeds.
Okay. I do see that Milos has his hand raised again. I'll go ahead and just remind folks, if you have a question, you can select the hand icon above the chat window, or you can also send your question in the chat. If you just dialed into the meeting, press #2 on your phone to enter the queue. And so Milos, why don't you go ahead and we'll see if others have questions as well.
Right, thank you. Just a couple of questions on what you covered, Kevin. So on the seasonal studies that you were mentioning, the 4 seasons, are those done, and you might have covered it, I might have missed it, but are those done once a year? You're calculating all 4 seasons, or do you go back and it's kind of in the middle of the year do another reassessment? When you do those seasonal studies once a year, you do that study for all 4 seasons?
So there's 3 seasonal cases from WEC. The long term, they do all of their study. They release the results of all of their studies at once. So they've got they're running all those cases, and then they'll be releasing those results in next week. The short-term horizon, we're updating times a year. So, for example, the winter, which covers, we do our winter baseline. We do in October, so late October, we'll release the updates based on the winter case for November, December, January, and February. And so we will have done those monthly cases. In February, we'll do March, April, and May, and we'll release those results, update those base ETC values. And then at the end of May, we'll do June through October. So at 12 cases a month, that May release, we're releasing the results from 60 heavy load cases plus a couple of summer light load cases. So lots of studies that we're doing, and we're trying to do those scenarios. Do all those permutations so that we can really find the right value.
No, thank you, Kevin. A question just on the load forecast. One more thing. I think we noted you utilize 1 and 2 non-coincidental peaks. Do you account for load forecast uncertainty in any way, or do you just assume since it's a 1 and 2 non-coincidental peak that you don't necessarily need to explicitly account for load forecast uncertainty?
We just used the straight load forecast. Okay. And then one just on the CBM and CRM topics. I recognize you don't use CBM, and is that because you feel that again your assumptions, your ETCs are robust enough to account for some of those other elements that CBM could otherwise be utilized? You recognize that the ETC ultimately that you derive based on different assumptions and the different scenarios that you run, wind on, wind off, and essentially covering for the worst case scenario amongst those, that essentially that's the reason you don't need a CBM, or is there a different reason for not having a CBM?
That is the reason. The way we calculate and derive our ETCs, the way we calculate and derive our TTCs are all relatively conservative. So there are actually many layers of conservancy built into our calculation process. Adding an additional CBM felt redundant.
Okay. So I appreciate that.
And the TTCs and ATCs are for commercial use, whereas CBM is more operational. And so we'll I think that we didn't need to further decrease what we have for commercial purposes, again because of the conservative nature already built in. Okay. No, very helpful. Thank you. Those are all the questions I had, and I think we can open it up for others as well.
I don't see anybody with their hands raised, but again, if you have a question, you can select the hand icon above the chat window, press #2 if you dialed in, or send it in the chat.
I do not yet see any hands raised in the queue at this time.
Okay, any final comments from the panelists, the BPA?
This is Milos. I'll just want to thank again the BPA team and express our gratitude, at least on behalf of the ISO, for taking the time and walking us through this very comprehensive presentation and taking the time to put that together. We certainly appreciate it. We found it very helpful and very informative. So thank you again for taking the time and putting that together to the BPA team.
welcome.
Okay, well, if there are no other questions, let me just then note some of the next steps. And like Christina noted, maybe Christina, you can go back to the date slide. There you go. You're going to see we're just confirming, and we're hoping to confirm here in the next day or so with Vistra if they are planning and able to present on either December 6th or the 7th. And once we get that confirmation, either way, we'll issue a market notice announcing the December 10th date, and we may need to look for potentially additional dates. If December 6th and 7th don't work for Vistra, if they need to present after the 10th, we can certainly find a date for that. But we will be announcing the next batch of dates for this particular working group here in this week to put on everybody's calendar. We'll notice it as well on our calendar. And then we are going to be issuing market notices later this week for the additional 2 working groups as we're wrapping up Working Group 1. We're going to be announcing the dates for Working Groups 2 and 3. We're going to circle back with the core team members to update some of the date options for those meetings, and then we'll issue those dates for Working Groups 2 and 3 that are focused on different aspects. Working Group 2 is focused on transmission products as well as assessing and determining whether there is sufficient ATC to accommodate requests. And then Working Group 3 focuses on an aspect that Jeff touched on earlier in the meeting, which is more of a focused discussion on the planning aspect. If an upgrade is needed, if a long-term request cannot be accommodated, and a potential study is needed to evaluate that request and potentially identify an upgrade, what is that process and how does it integrate with our current planning paradigm and some of those associated processes related to that study and expansion aspect. I think, Christina, we see a hand from Kathleen that wants to.
Yeah, Kathleen, go ahead.
Sure, I was just going to jump in and say, it's Kathleen Colbert from Vistra, and thanks, Milos, for kind of going over this. I need and want to give a little context for the broader working group, and then also invite anyone to reach out to me. I think my email is out there. I've been trying to get together with a couple different of the working group members, kind of offline, and explore whether or not, what might be a productive way to kind of move forward in one of these upcoming workshops to kind of get into, okay, now how do we feel about applying this to California? I do, have some of those calls set up. I'm looking forward to them. That's my only reason I'm kind of hesitant, on December 6th or 7th. If it could be very informal, I think then for sure I'm happy to kind of take point and help collaborate and facilitate sharing what we've discussed and inviting others who have been having those other offline conversations to jump in as well. I don't know if we'll have a formal presentation because I don't think anything will be ready to be gelled out of those conversations. But I did want to throw that out there, see if Kaiso had any feedback on your preference for kind of format, if you would start to try and delve into that on Monday or Tuesday, and see if anyone else has any questions for me.
Yeah, thanks, Kathleen. This is Milos. I'll note,
Sure.
This doesn't necessarily have to be a formal presentation. It could be Vistra and others sharing based on what we've heard, based on certain aspects of the ISO market. How could then some of what we've learned be potentially considered and applied in the KISO context for deriving ATC, calculating those native load needs, and potentially some of those margins. So it doesn't have to be a formal positional presentation from any entities, including Vistra. But if you have certain ideas or thoughts that you want to vet, and I think this would be a good opportunity to share that, and we can have a dialogue during one of those meetings.
That's great. Thanks for the feedback. Appreciate it.
Yeah.
Okay, let me just scan to see if we have any other hands in the queue. I don't see any questions. So just a reminder, we did record the meeting today, and we also recorded the past working group meetings. Those recordings are available on the NISTA webpage, which the link is provided here on this slide. And that's where you'll also find the presentations. And again, thank you so much to the BPA today for sharing your practices. Greatly appreciate all of the EIM entities sharing practices in past meetings. So unless there are no other questions, we can go ahead and conclude today's meeting. Like Milos said, once we get those dates firmed up for the future meetings, we will issue a notice. So thanks again, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day.